I want to consider a few kinds of solutions, some of which will be expansions on topics already covered. Firstly, what is to be considered as a solution? By solution I mean cultural norms, and to a lesser extent, criminalization of behavior. Noting how potentially horrifying the criminalization of behavior can be as a matter of cultural norms of behavior. Secondly, a solution to what problem? In essence, to problems of human love and sexual dynamics. There is a notion going around that is worth considering. The notion is that the individuals involved strictly determine what constitutes consent. There is a sensibility to this disposition, however, as the previous sections have attempted to display, such runs afoul the point of presumed one-way executive authority, the iterative gendered sexual violence and sexual violence as societal norm sections in particular. Beyond the mereness of consent, such runs afoul the issues of meeting the needs, wants and desires of everyone involved, which ostensibly is the actual point of having anything like a relationship, sexual or otherwise. Still, we may assume something like the following to be the case, that the only consensual sexuality is one in which all parties involved agree to it. Left on the table there is the mechanics of how, and the motivations involved. The notion of this as a problem is rather simple, it pretty much ignores the wills of the people involved. It says something like, just have a conversation. Having a conversation about it doesn't actually necessarily bring about a meeting of the minds regarding what to do. Moreover, people will tend towards consistently selecting for some particular preference they have, and will tend to select against some other kinds of options available. To just have a conversation, in other words, amounts to fight it out, which is perhaps not the best sort of advice to give. Beyond the points regarding iterative sexual violence, there are other sorts of issues involved that are worth examining. Consider for instance the issues involved with choosing a place to eat, what's for dinner, or what to watch. When there are a lot of options available, different people are enabled to have a variety of preferences, will tend to have differing opinions, and so forth. The seemingly small point, variety of options, actually can play a rather large role in the problematic outcomes folks are experiencing in the current. We may hold something like, well, what's wrong with that? To which we can hold there are actually a lot of things potentially wrong with that. Suppose, after all, that we are speaking of biases, racial biases, and we just hold the view that people ought to select towards their particular preferences. We ought to expect that folks will tend to select repeatedly toward their particular preferences, and hence we have racism. But it's worse than this, for the selecting by preferences also deprives the individual doing the selecting of trying other foods, genres of movies, and so on. In essence, they are harming themselves through the preference selecting process. Worse still, that kind of bland selecting by preference will tend towards dispositions of negative views about those kinds of things they are not selecting. When asked to explain, for instance, as to why it is that someone selects for a particular food or genre of movie, they will tend to give some negative take on the other kinds of options. Historical examples abound, and indeed any individual reader of this ought to have a plethora of personal examples to note. I don't want to attempt to try and provide specific examples, as it is more apt to provide for the form of the problem. If someone is asked, why not try this other kind of thing, the answer can be of the form, because it has this or that negative trait. Such doesn't have to be the case, but such is the case very often, almost as if by reflex and defensiveness. I don't like being mistaken for something must therefore be wrong with a given thing. The reader ought be able to get a sense of how this kind of response can result in such issues as sexism, racism, bigotry, etc. But let me spell it out nonetheless. Because I don't like sexual acts of thus and such a sort, therefore there must be some reason why, and that reason why must be that there is something wrong with sexual acts of thus and such a sort. Or, because I don't like skin color of such and thus a sort, there must be some reason why, and therefore there must be something wrong with skin color of such and thus a sort. Less inflammatorily speaking, because I don't like this or that kind of food, there must be some reason why, and therefore there must be something wrong with that kind of food. Such isn't to suggest that there are no reasons why. The suggestion at this point is that the inference that there must therefore be something wrong simply doesn't follow. However, the issues with preference selection do not end there. To be clear, not only is that a concern for the ethical concerns, it is also an issue for the aesthetic concerns. To hold that there is something wrong ethically speaking with the thing doesn't follow as a reflexive act relative to one's personal dispositions of any sort. Worse so when in point of fact the person making the claim hasn't even tried the thing in question. Nor aesthetically does such follow, as the person making the claim doesn't even have a point of reference from which to draw from. The notion that it is wrong, aesthetically speaking, that it is ugly, or tastes bad, is a matter of preference selection without having actually bothered to try the thing. This fails, in other words, on experiential grounds to make the claim, and in matters of aesthetics, as is evidence in all fields of aesthetics, it fails as a matter of failure to develop a taste for the thing in question. Selecting for preference fails to enable the individuals doing the selecting to formulate meaningful views about what they are selecting. Much as with foods or genres of movies, folks will tend to grow a taste for them as they try them out. Repeatedly trying a given food, in other words, enables people to develop their palate for the food. Such is fairly well understood within the foodie communities. Developing a palate for wine, cheese, coffees, etc. all take time and effort, a certain kind of bravery to try something. Such isn't to suggest that all such things are merely nothing more than growing accustomed to some kind of taste. Some things we may hold are, say, unhealthy to eat. However, such is to hold the position that there are broad categories of things, acts, etc., which are actually little more than growing accustomed to tastes, and that the disposition that something, therefore, must be wrong, because someone doesn't prefer this or that thing underpins many of the social ills that plague human dynamics. Not only on an individual level, but also on a basic relationship dynamic level, and on a large-scale societal level. Other sorts of issues, when we're dealing with a basic dynamic between two people trying to decide such things, again, just speaking of foods, or what to watch, we'd expect that differing people will tend to come to some kind of answer predicated upon modalities that attempt to fight about it in some way. There are shockingly simple solutions to it, such as yelling, screaming, forcing the person to make the choice. There are also more subtle methods that force the disposition of executive authority on the matter, the persons who say no repeatedly until the option that they want is the only one left, or at any rate, is the one that is proposed. There is of course the possibility that one can just find the person that has the same tastes, but such supposes that one can just select off the shelf a person who does exactly that. Which is not only improbable, but a very odd kind of disposition, indeed, an infamously unethical kind of disposition that treats people like objects whose only worth is their instrumentality to one's own desires. There are odd methodologies that include pretense, e.g. pretending to give up something they value, in order to obtain something they likewise pretend they don't value. All of these are of course extremely dubious methods of love, sexuality, and relationship dynamics. When individuals within a loving sexual relationship repeatedly select via personal preferences, those involved will tend towards disagreements and/or stagnation. There is a somewhat odd problem with the scope of options available. When folks have few options available, they tend to learn to love, prefer, those particular things. They grow accustomed to them, in short. Conversely, when folks have a plethora of options available, there can be a kind of incapacity to develop tastes, to settle on something. This has some rather unexpected issues to it when it comes to individuals, basic relationship dynamics, and societal ills. Note that this isn't and ought not be construed as saying that folks who have a lot of relationships have difficulties forming emotional bonds. I suspect this kind of reasoning is related to what is being said here. But such is clearly false even on the grounds of reason. Finding lots of tasty foods doesn't entail that one therefore lacks taste, it just means that one has lots of differing tastes. So too with loves and sexualities, because I have loved and been sexual with more than one person doesn't entail that I didn't love any of them, it entails that I loved all of them. Such relates directly to the notion under examination as a solution. Individuals just talk it out. When a plethora of options are available, individuals can develop a tendency of indecision. In the case of foods, for instance, individuals presented with hundreds of options have to spend a lot of time trying to make some kind of decision. Moreover, the processes of making the decisions becomes burdensome. There is little reason to suppose that there are meaningful differences on this point in regards to what folks are making the decision on. In the relevant case of relationship sexual dynamics, we are largely speaking of the variations in how sexuality is expressed. Such includes individual sexual acts, but it also includes modalities of sexuality, fetishes, number of participants, and body types of those involved. In terms of relationship types, we are speaking of such things as monogamy, polyamory, degrees of commitments, short, casual, long-term, degrees of entanglement with each other, and so forth. This, however, is perhaps the least of the concerns. Nuance becomes important. Making a distinction between differing options whereby those differences are nuanced may become pointless. Pointless in the sense that choosing this or that doesn't really have the kind of affective nature that the individual thinks it has. Choosing between this or that hamburger joint has nuances of differences, but those differences simply aren't necessarily meaningfully important. Choosing which movie to watch, likewise, has nuances of differences involved, but those nuances of differences don't actually have any meaningful import. Likewise, choosing between individual sexual acts and choosing between differing relationship style options doesn't necessarily entail any sort of meaningful affective form in the nuances of differences involved. Disagreements between lovers regarding exactly what sexual act to do at any given point doesn't really matter. It's only in the iterative form of such decisions, that is, only in the longer term, that the decisions can have meaningful negative affects. To be clear on that point, saying yes or no at any given sexual act doesn't matter, the nuance is unimportant. The issues of consent within that do carry import. The point is that the individual sexual acts as such don't carry any particular import. Though upon iteration of such things, such can and oft enough does lead to the serious issues laid out in the iterative gendered sexual violence and sexual violence as societal norm sections. To be blunt about the issues as they relate to sexism and bigotry in particular, the iterative form of such selection practices form the basis whereby negative views about sexual acts and sexual violence stem from. As folks selectively select, and take such selections so dreadfully seriously, they end up forming on the one hand serious instances of normalized sexual violence in its iterative form, and on the other hand the instances of serious sexual violence in the cultural genocidal tendencies form, and on the third hand the cultural norms of behavior that come to define culturalized sexual violence in the individual instantiation's form. Disagreements regarding exactly what relationship style people are involved with is more complicated, largely because those kinds of things take shape upon iterative form, rather than any particular point within the relationship, but also because a relationship entails a lot of other aspects that entangle those involved together. Hence, therein the ethical capacity to change between this or that modality of relationship carries more import than individual sexual acts. To simply change one's relationship modality carries with it an ethical import of the others involved in a way that simply doesn't obtain when it comes to individual sexual acts. This relates directly to the notion that individuals just talk it out, in that changing one's opinion on it entails longer-term and more significant consequences to everyone involved. For instance, to be monogamous at one point, and then simply change to polyamorous, and then change back to monogamy entails significant changes in the lives of the people involved. Among the worst cases of this are when those kinds of changes are made predicated upon the whim, feeling, or even reason and rationality of only one person involved in such things. Such amounts to a kind of tyranny. There is a name for this kind of modality of relationship anarchy. It is the style of relationship that holds rather directly to the notion that individuals ought to just talk it out. It begs all the questions as to the mechanics, proper considerations involved, circumstances, etc., that are being laid out here. There is a sense of entitlement involved by persons who hold that they ought be able to change their relationship modality without consideration of the other people involved in their relationship. It isn't, however, the case that such ought be understood as there being no modality of change involved. Nor, for that matter, ought it be understood as a reflexive movement towards lack of options available. The point and question here is how a plethora of options presents its own sorts of problems within a relationship. In terms of how folks may change their minds regarding a given relationship, such presents the relevant sort of infidelity towards one's lovers. The disposition that there is no good faith in a relationship. On the individual level, the plethora presents itself as the availability of options that are better than their current, placing the individual in a position that they can always move on and find someone else. Such a mentality firstly can paralyze the individual in their choices, presenting them with the pretense that they can choose this or that option, modality of relationship, or persons. A failure to commit, to put it bluntly. Worse though, is that the plethora of options presents the individual with a belief that they can simply change their mind on a whim, with the only meaningful concern being something akin to how they feel in the moment, or how they so happen to be moved by broader cultural movements. Such amounts to the modality of relationship anarchy. On a relationship level, the plethora of options, when understood from the relationship anarchy perspective, entails that the individuals involved may simply change their minds without meaningful consideration of the others involved. Whomsoever happens to change their mind more in this modeling forces the other persons involved to adapt or end the relationship. If the individual holds, for thus and such a reason, it hardly matters what reason exactly, that they ought be monogamous, the others involved are forced to either become monogamous or end the relationship. If the other persons involved refuse, the person insisting that they become monogamous is presented with the same kind of choice, forcing the relationship on the threat of ending it. In either case, they are ignoring the wills, the needs, wants and desires of the others involved, holding to a principle of individualism. Hence, within that framing, where one's own needs, wants and desires are paramount, amounts to a fight to try and meet those needs, wants, and desires. In this regard too, there are issues related to either ignoring the options available or insisting on trying all of them. In the former, as it relates to meeting the needs, wants and desires of one's lovers, such is a denial of exactly those needs, wants and desires. Of the latter, insisting on trying them all, can also deny the needs, wants and desires of one's lovers. Again, there may be meaningful differences involved. Some movie may be terrible, some hamburger joint may be providing extremely low quality food, or food that will give you food poisoning. However, such distinctions are actually rare. The far more common case is that the differences are nominal. There isn't going to be a lot of effective harm or benefit one way or another, beyond the specific goods and bads associated with meeting or failing to meet the needs, wants and desires of one's lovers. In terms of human behavior, this has a surprisingly bad tendency of people to fight over petty things. Something I am sure most folks beyond a certain age are familiar with. The point, however, is that such things are in part a consequence of having a plethora of choices available. Something that for most of human history hasn't actually been available. People may, in other words, be utilizing a scarcity mentality and applying it to a society where there is a plethora. A little bit deeper, folks may be taking a mental tool utilized to distinguish between things of import and applying them to things that are trivial. In a scarcity society, distinctions such as these may provide important information regarding one's surroundings. Distinguishing the subtle differences between this or that plant entails a differentiation between edible and inedible foods, for instance. That kind of nuance matters. Distinguishing between this or that edible food, however, is not only trivial, but by taking it overly seriously, making that kind of distinction becomes harmful for human dynamics. Where survival is at stake, nuance matters a fair amount. Where the differences are between aesthetics of tastes, such distinctions are trivial at best, and potentially quite harmful. Harmful specifically as they relate to taking the whole thing overly seriously, and the tendency for folks to assume something is wrong, ethically, aesthetically, etc., in virtue of the fact that they don't like it. That justification leads in those cases, and such is a significant and serious issue and quandary for people. In relation to sexuality and love's dynamics, a very similar principle applies. When the issues surround high costs to a person's life, understanding the nuances of differences matters a great deal. Taking sexual violence seriously, after all, does matter to people's lives. Hence the nuance given to the topic in this piece. That said, the costs associated with sexuality as such are dramatically lessened. Specifically, effective modern birth control, medicines, and safer sex practices available to handle the potential of viral infections. This piece holds rather bluntly to the point that statistically speaking, the costs associated with sexual activity in general as a matter of personal safety are actually very tiny, wildly blown out of proportion, and generally geared in highly unethical sexist manners, e.g., women are weak, need protection, men always DTF, men violent, etc. In the current, there remain significant costs associated with sexuality, specifically as regards marriage and having kids together, but I will leave that to another section. When the costs are lowered, the capacity for folks to partake in the goods associated with sexuality and love's relations increases. An issue at play in the current is an attitude as if the costs were still very high. The notion, for instance, that one takes their life in their hand every time they go on a date is false as a matter of fact. Going on a date is far less dangerous than, say, going for a drive. The suspicion, in other words, is that folks are taking a scarcity high-risk kind of nuance dreadfully seriously, whereby those kinds of concerns are simply not applicable. What's worse still is that folks are taking their preference selection as if it implied a lifelong commitment. Folks' selection criteria, in other words, is off in terms of basic sexual and loving relationships, whereby the plethora of available options is mistaken as a selection of a one and only. Which isn't to suggest that finding a long-term partner isn't valuable, it is simply to suggest that the effective requirement of the selection has to be for a long-term partner just isn't valid. Noting again that such is a post-effective modern birth control and post-effective medicine reality that simply is not validly applied to pre-effective modern birth control and pre-effective medicine reality. Nor, for that matter, in any instance where there is no effective modern birth control or medicines. In terms of internal relationship dynamics, this entails odd behavior relative to the relationship and the circumstances within which the relationship exists. For instance, concerns about being replaced by someone else is predicated upon a notion that any given selection entails a one and only kind of mentality. Notions of jealousy, which may have relevance wherein the risk of one's partner leaving entails a significant cost, makes sense. This cost can be material or emotional. To be clear, the point is that in a cultural disposition such that sexuality does not entail a necessary lifelong commitment, these kinds of concerns are not justifiable. Though in instances whereby the aim is exactly long-term commitment, these kinds of concerns may be justifiable, though I will strongly suggest that such concerns in those circumstances remain overblown. In terms of material loss, the costs are far less than they used to be, but they are not non-existent. See also the Moneyless Free Labor Society series for some consideration given to these and related points in this section, wherein material costs of separation or togetherness are effectively minimized. In terms of emotional costs, they remain high, and arguably they ought to remain high. Emotional attachment is the formative structure of long-term loving sexual relationships. However, note that in terms of what sexual and loving relations may entail in a post-effective modern birth control and medicine culture can give very misleading impressions regarding the validity of the emotional state so expressed. For instance, the potential harms associated with being sexual with more than one lover at a time are fairly radically lessened via effective modern birth control, various medicines, and safer sex practices entailing far less potential health risks. There are some straightforward methods that aren't complicated, such as folks recognizing the virtues involved in trying new things, and understanding the problems associated with selecting by preferences alone. Taking turns, for instance, isn't a particularly difficult notion. We may possibly express concerns regarding how that relates to sexuality and consent, but I want to strongly suggest that such amounts to taking sexuality as a fundamental negative, and taking it oh so dreadfully seriously. When sexuality is understood as a general positive, when any given act of sexuality isn't viewed as a negative, the notion that one ought not or can't, or that it is problematic, tends to diminish. Again, such isn't to suggest that folks can't or ought not say no. It is far more about a general attitude that accrues upon iterative actions of the individuals involved. To sum up on this particular supposed solution, just talk. There are good and bad faith methodologies of talking. If folks take it as a battle of wills, folks ought to expect a battle of wills, with expected sorts of results. People using and abusing each other in their relationships, tending towards a wide variety of sex-negative viewpoints, and one or the other suffering from iterative sexual violence, effectively sublimating one will for another, and plausibly expressions of non-iterative sexual violence, rape, sexual assault, etc., as folks may tend to take it out on folks due to sexuality being crafted as a battle of the wills, compare, after all, to the notion of rape as an expression of power. Specifically, we might expect iterative sexual violence as a modality within the dynamic of creating non-iterative sexual violence. When one person in a dynamic systematically has their sexual needs, wants, and desires not met, folks might expect the possibility that they will act out via some non-iterative sexual violence. Worse than that, when one person's sexual needs, wants and desires are sublimated to another's, forced to conform to someone else's, when they are iteratively raped, sexually assaulted, forced to do the things over and over again in a sick dynamic, that perhaps it would be the case that they act out. Such isn't to condone the latter, or the former for that matter, it is to again point out the sexual dynamics in play when it comes to where sexual violence may be stemming from in general. Would it really be any surprise to anyone if one form of sexual violence led to another form of sexual violence? Or that the more obvious and visible, easy to recognize form of sexual violence takes the fore, and the less visible, less easily recognizable form of sexual violence would be in the background, unnoted, unresolved, and not sufficiently dealt with? Would it be any surprise to people that sex-negative views lead to negative affects of sexual violence? Another methodology that is oft put out there is cultural normalization. This has some appeal to folks as it also offers a rather straightforward and simple solution to the issue. It holds that if everyone simply agrees to some particular cultural normalized form, then by definition at least there is an understanding and agreement. Consent issue solved. Of course, this belies a lot of issues that ought be apparent in the current. For one, it holds that all other cultural expressions are invalid, cultural genocide becomes the reality. Such also is highly dependent upon what those cultural norms really are. A cultural norm that holds that one sex has all the power of determination definitionally is rape, which, see much of the arguments in this series to try and grasp how deeply that particular notion is embedded within our current society. Such risks things like criminalization of various sexual behaviors, and as we are seeing in the current, the criminalization of various harmless non-sexual behaviors that have some kind of sexual intent to them. I want to strongly suggest here that cultural normalization as a methodology is something that ought happen after there is a broad understanding as to what the proper modality of such would be. It is not, in other words, a means of ethical soundness in and of itself. Rather, it is merely something that ought happen in the aftermath of ethical soundness. Here folks ought be able to catch the scent of the ethical relativists. Namely, only an ethical relativist could possibly hold that the actual means of making something ethical is cultural normalization. There being, for them, after all, nothing more to ethical considerations than a supposition of cultural normalcy. To be clear and again, for the cultural relativist, cultural normalcy and ethical soundness are exactly the same thing. To them, in other words, a cultural norm of persecution of the queers is ethically sound because, after all, there being nothing more to ethics than cultural normalcy. Similarly, for any number of other kinds of sexual ethical fouls to which for the cultural relativist, they are not only perfectly fine, but indeed, strong oughts simply in virtue of their being cultural norms. Now, a cultural relativist would counter, well, they would counter differently from cultural relativist to cultural relativist because of course they would winky face. Such really is something of the point of the problem with such folks. Each of them would advocate for some other version of cultural dogma because they've ultimately got nothing else to offer. There are, however, valuable and positive lessons to be learned via the cultural relativist and the notion of cultural normalcy. It is true that there are in point of fact differing cultural norms, and indeed, differing ethical norms of behavior, perhaps especially in regards to sexuality and love's relations. Moreover, it is the case that not all of these can be valid at the same time. Some of these are rather explicitly exclusive in their formulation, dogmatic in their implementation, and seek to eradicate other forms. These the bads out there. Finally, it is the case that one aspect of an ethical good is to be considered culturally normal, and hence to normalize something that is in point of fact ethically valid is actually a good and an important thing to do. There are ethical bads out there that seek to eradicate good and wholesome human expressions of sexuality and love after all. The point here though really is that for all that, the concept of cultural normalization as if that were all there is to the questions of the ethics of sex and love is insufficient, grossly so, and indeed, quite extremely counterproductive as they tend towards a view that is little more than a free-for-all fight predicated upon one's personal tastes. Loathing, actual loathing is the appropriate response to the combo relationship anarchist and cultural relativist. They indeed have no ethics whatsoever, and are merely live streaming their emotional states. I want to present a kind of solution, which in a meaningful sense is also out there in the discourse. Good, giving, and game. The notion is fairly unabashedly sex positive. I want to add to that, relationship fidelity. Each of these deserves a bit of clarification, and my own sort of take on them. Good, in this context, good doesn't denote a specific modality of good or ethics. After all, the whole, good, giving, game and relationship fidelity are being presented as a kind of ethical response to the current whereby the specificity of a supposed good or ethic being imposed, especially one-sidedly, is exactly the problem of note. Good ought be understood as denoting a generalized sex-positive attitude, the notion that at the least, any consensual sexuality is not a bad. No particular sexual acts that come within the bounds of consensuality are understood as bad. Folks may preference this or that sexual act, however the inference that is made to those sexual acts they don't preference, that therefore there must be something wrong with those sexual acts they do not preference, is not valid. Moreover, good in this context has to go beyond the limitations of mereness of consensuality, noting how culturally derived consent really is, and hence how there are markedly and remarkably different versions of consensuality, each of which are valid. In other words, and very bluntly, consensuality entails a metacultural stance to handle the intercultural reality that we're actually dealing with. In this context, good amounts to essentially the levity, light-hearted disposition regarding sexuality. Sexual attention is a good, unless and until it is made into a bad. No means no, yes. Yes means yes, no. Giving, this amounts to meeting the needs, wants and desires of one's lovers. Oddly, this is likely the most controversial aspect of this ethic. It holds rather bluntly that the ethical, good, aim of a sexual loving relationship is exactly to meet the needs, wants and desires of one's lovers. It is not to meet one's own personal needs, wants and desires. The notion ought be rather straightforward. When a set of lovers has the giving ethic in mind, their own needs, wants and desires are also met. This point gets caught up in controversy for a variety of reasons. For one thing, it appears to go against the notion of personal autonomy. It holds, after all, a disposition that the point of sexual relationships, especially sexual loving relationships, doesn't have anything meaningful to do with the individual's personal preferences and choice in the matter. I highlight appears because such is, of course, mere appearance. This giving disposition runs fairly strongly counter to the individualistic disposition, but it doesn't suggest that the individuals involved don't have choice or preference in the matter. On a fairly uncharitable reading, being giving in sexuality already contains choice and individual preference in the sense of choosing if to be sexual with someone else at all. I say this is an uncharitable reading because it fails to consider the relevant dynamics within actual sexual intercourse. Nonetheless, it is very plausible to hold that if an individual has made the choice to actually be sexual with someone else, that having sexual intercourse actually might entail a few things. If one agrees to sit at a table of a feast, one might expect that in virtue of that agreement one is in fact agreeing to some things. A feast, that is, actually entails something that one is agreeing to. This dovetails well with the notion of consent given elsewhere in this series, that agreeing to participating in a sex room where there is a sign on the door denoting that it is indeed a sex room is actually a giving of consent. One doesn't also need give consent to each and every sexual act within the sex room. To hold to that view is to hold to the consent cultist view of sexuality, and it is a rather destructive notion of consensuality that reduces it to the aforementioned loathsome relationship anarchist cultural relativist combo. Folks might also recognize them as the hyper-individualists. Still, the question of what things sexual intercourse might entail is relevant. Here we are holding that any sexual act, within the bounds of consensual sexuality, is exactly what sexual intercourse entails. Being giving holds an ethic regarding iterative functional sexual relationships, not individual sexual acts. Again, an individual saying no to any given sexual act, for whatever reason, is fine. Likewise, an individual saying no to being sexual with any given other person is fine. There is, in other words, no ethical imperative to being sexual with anyone else in particular. Nor is there an ethical imperative to being sexual in any given particular way, at any particular point. However, and it is a big O, however, there are actual ethical imperatives in sexuality to meet the needs, wants and desires of one's lovers. As noted earlier in this series, that kind of ethical imperative is one that takes shape primarily within the iterative form of a relationship. The consequences for not meeting that ethical imperative actually amount to sexual violence and rape in the worst of cases. Another plausible consequence of failing to meet that ethical imperative is essentially a lack of any sexuality between the lovers at all, an ending of the sexual relationship as such, and that will entail an ending of the relationship at all. Due to the currents of the discourse, it is likely relevant to note how the failure to meet the ethical imperative affects women, as it is women who are in the current expressing the most outrage over the claim. I'll note however that what applies to women also applies to men. Consider that your lover may not enjoy giving you oral sex, or may not enjoy giving you BDSM sex play. Are we to hold therefore that the woman simply ought not be allowed to partake in those kinds of sexual acts? Or that they ought to therefore simply leave, drop a relationship like a sack of potatoes, and pick another dude off the shelf? Again, it is tempting and so deeply entrenched in the current discourse on the topic to hold that the woman has the right to refuse, that women in particular are making the very poor assumption that all guys want to do these kinds of things with them, and they merely have to offer the opportunity to do them. It is a kind of gender trap thinking that especially the feministas ought to recognize, given that it is their supposed field of expertise. The notion that a male lover ought to continue a sexual encounter towards the ends of meeting the needs, wants and desires of a female lover is practically a meme at this point. Yet, the notion that a female lover ought to do the same is mistaken as if doing so were tantamount to rape. Here, the solution being proposed is an ethical imperative to be giving to one's lovers, as that is, in some merely sexual sense at any rate, one of the points of sexuality. There may be claims that sexuality only has as its point procreation, but such is a dismissible claim on so many grounds that it's honestly not really worth going into. See also the extensive discussion in power dynamics, inequalities, as it relates to the teleology and ethicity of sexuality. Consider the issue again. Saying yes to being sexual with someone, what does that entail? Suppose that there is a known metric as to what that actually entails. Let's pretend for a moment that being sexual meant nothing more than penile/vaginal intercourse. Let's make the not-so-wild assumption that the potential lovers know that that is what it means to be sexual with each other. When they both say yes, they are consenting to being sexual with each other, meaning they are consenting to penile/vaginal intercourse. It would be exceedingly odd to hold that saying yes to sexual intercourse didn't also including saying yes to penile/vaginal intercourse, and that one would have to ask again just prior to the doing of the penile/vaginal intercourse. It literally makes no sense. Suppose that being sexual with each other entails oral, anal, vaginal, mutual masturbation, various sexual acts, etc., the whole gamut of ethically valid sorts of sexual acts. When consent is given, when the lovers say yes to each other, they are knowingly saying yes to participate in all the ethically valid sexual acts with each other. The upshot of this is that consent was given from the get-go and doesn't have to be applied for each act. Note that this really does amount to how we understand and define sexuality, and if we are holding to sexuality as a positive. When we speak of consent, we can very well ought to understand it as consenting to what exactly? Where oral, anal, vaginal, etc., intercourse are understood as valid ethical sorts of sexuality, it is entirely plausible to hold that to consent to sexuality at all is to consent to any and all sexuality with a lover. There is a temptation to default to a supposition of vaginal/penile sexuality as that which is consented to without any further consentment given. However, such is a very odd disposition to have within any sex-positive framework that holds that all consensual sexual acts are equally valid. Moreover, supposing that we are taking as the ethical imperative that the aim of sexual intercourse is exactly to meet the needs, wants and desires of one's lovers, and in turn, having them meet your needs, wants and desires, the claim of to what exactly is consent being given may exactly entail an assumption prima facie of consent being given to any sort of sexual act. Again, the right to say no at any given point remains, but the assumption of a yes to any and all valid sexual acts does follow with a yes. When the lovers say yes, in other words, they are saying yes towards the end of doing their very best, good faith effort, to meet the needs, wants and desires of their lovers. In other words, the consent that is being given is exactly to do their best to meet the needs, wants and desires of their lovers, within the ethical framework of what constitutes ethically valid sexual expressions. Note that one aspect of that is exactly consensuality, the question of when consent is being given, and to what exactly it is being given, are not the same sorts of things. Note that best good faith effort doesn't actually entail each person doing anything and everything the other person says, especially not at any given moment. Again, the ethical imperative applies far more to iterative sexual relationship functions, longer-term sexual functions, and not to any given sexual act, at any given moment. To be blunt, a no in the moment is valid. That is, while blanket consent is given within the context of a sexual relationship, that is, all sexual acts are taken to be on the table at any given time, a no is applicable to a given sexual act. To be equally blunt, The imperative of lovers is to exactly aim to do the sexual acts and relationship styles of their lovers. In terms of sexual acts, the issue is far less difficult, in the sense that the sexual acts are actually generally pleasurable for everyone involved. The issues therein having far more to do with sex-negative views on the topics, tabooed acts, and so forth, rather than anything actually wrong, unethical, or even unwanted on the part of anyone involved. Givingness has further aspects to it worth seriously considering. The notion of comfort sex, for instance, can actually play a meaningful role, especially in long-term relationships. No participant in the sexual act is necessarily committed to only participating, providing that it is something that they are actively in the mood for. This is another controversial aspect of the givingness ethic. As with other aspects, it ought be understood as an ethic predicated upon the iterative form of sexuality, rather than any given instance. Although it is repeating something highlighted earlier in this series, it is worth repeating. The initiators, typically men in this culture, are not always down to fuck just because they are initiating. This likely cannot be stressed enough in this culture. Thinking that just because a man initiates sexual contact that they are in the mood or rip-roaring and ready to go is flatly false on every level. The reasons why an initiator initiates vary a great deal. Such can be stemming from social pressures to perform. It can be stemming from the role of initiator as such, as in, I know she isn't going to initiate, so even though I am not exactly in the mood, I will nonetheless initiate. It can stem from a sense of compassion, as in, I know she needs this, so I will give it to her. A sense of bonding in especially long-term relationships, as in, I know we need this, so I will initiate. A sense of love, as in, I love her, so I am going to express that via sexuality, and hence I will initiate. And sense of duty, as in, it is my duty to perform the role of initiator, so I will initiate, and so forth. And I mean, of course, sometimes the initiator is actually just horny winky face. From the receiver's perspective, typically women, as they are not aware of the motivations, only the actions of initiating, it will look like the man is always just horny. And hence, we get all kinds of tropes, cultural misapprehensions, and so forth regarding men. These do not primarily stem from men, they are primarily stemming from women's perceptions of men, and of course their own experiences, which like anyone else's are myopic in their form when they are considered in isolation. More generally speaking, they are stemming from the highly gendered roles of initiators and receivers, and the argument holds, therefore, that to deal with this issue women ought to begin initiating a lot more. As it pertains to givingness in a sexual relationship, this point is fairly well crucial for especially women to grasp at, because it undercuts the perception of the gender trap dynamic whereby as receivers they are being expected to provide sex for their lovers. The point being that both the initiator and the receiver are being expected to provide sex for their lovers, which of course they are. Again, consent still pertains and maintains, but what is being consented to actually matters. The ethicity of consent isn't as straightforward as it may appear. Consent on an individual sexual act is pretty straightforward, consent to sexuality is somewhat less so, and consent as it pertains to especially long-term sexual relationships looks essentially little like consent as it pertains to individual sexual acts. Givingness applies in most cases. The most limiting case of its applicability having to do with first times, one-night stands, and such. It can apply to these, but in general those kinds of cases are the sorts whereby the individuals involved are figuring out each other, maybe at their most timid, and so forth. Such isn't always the case, the excitement of something new and fresh may actually entail a sort of givingness in sexuality that is out of the norm for the persons involved. Besides which, there is a rather straightforward time restriction on one-night stands and first times. There is only so much that folks can do within that time frame. The sort of consent that folks are largely pointing to in the current is the consent that applies to exactly these sorts of situations. That said, and this is fairly important, the kind of consent that folks are pointing to is also caught up in the sex-negative view regarding the variety of sexual acts, the various taboos, and cultural norms of expectation. When folks hear sex, they tend to think something like penile/vaginal, or a bit more generally, they tend to think of that which is least taboo, and most preferenced in their personal opinion on the matter. This or that other kind of sex act is something different, it is something that is not explicitly consented to, in other words, by the view in the current, even if consent is given. Which, to be clear, is not the view being expressed by the givingness ethic. The givingness ethic holds that all sexual acts within the framework of consent are valid and expressly consented to when consent is given. In other words, a blanket yes is granted with consent, that is tempered by the availability of the no in any given instance. Understand that to not hold this view is to implicitly or explicitly hold that there are some kinds of sexual acts that have special status, that are tabooed in one way or another in virtue of their sexuality, and not for some other kind of ethically valid reason to taboo it. Note that in addition to the inherent stigmatization that comes with that particular viewpoint, which will thereby come to manifest itself within society as a whole, there is also the issues involved with the unethicalness in how lovers treat each other, failure to meet the needs, wants and desires of their lovers. In terms of relationship styles, similar notions arise, though these are best explored within the context of relationship fidelity. Game, the notion of unwanted sexual behavior is its own aspect of being game in regards to sexuality. Unwanted likely requires some degree of clarification. Again, it is plausible that at any given point in time, someone isn't in the mood for this or that sexual act. For the same reasons, they may not be in the mood for any given sexual encounter. But the notion of unwanted, whereby the sexual act itself isn't pleasurable, is largely false. I say largely, as some kinds of sexual acts may in point of fact not be pleasurable. The distinction is, however, rather extremely important. Much as folks who've never tasted of a certain kind of food, or had bad experiences with a certain kind of food, may make up reasons or misunderstand the kind of food as if it were a bad, so too do folks do so with particular kinds of sexual acts. Oral, for instance, is pleasurable, but there can be bad experiences with giving or receiving oral sex. Anal sex is pleasurable, but there can be bad experiences with giving or receiving anal sex. Threesomes and foursomes are pleasurable, and so forth. In that sense, there is nothing either unethical nor undesirable about any of these sexual acts. In a very real sense, one's lovers are exactly wanting those kinds of sexual acts, even when they say they don't. Again, this kind of distinction is as it applies to iterative sexual relationships, and not necessarily to individual sexual instances. One's lovers want these kinds of sexual acts in the sense of iterative sexual experiences. They are pleasurable sorts of sexual experiences. Want, in this sense, is a matter of understanding that these are pleasurable sorts of experiences, not want in the sense of wanting in the moment. Consider the point again of foods. For folks that have a dreadfully serious disposition towards sexuality, the notion of comparing sexuality to tastes in foods may itself be understood as distasteful, but such is of course to be expected from their disposition. To gain a taste for foods, one has to try them. Such may take time, multiple times of trying, in order to gain a proper appreciation of them. The wanting of the foods in this sense is the understanding that the foods actually taste good, and the understanding that the person will generally enjoy them, regardless of if they think they want. This is undoubtedly among the more controversial notions, but it is something that is also rather obviously correct. Its controversy having far more to do with the tabooing of sexuality, the various sex-negative views, and the taking of sexuality dreadfully seriously, than anything to do with the ethicity, pleasurability or lack thereof of the sexual acts themselves. In a very meaningful sense, if the tabooed aspects are removed, if the issues of preference decision-making are dealt with, if the notion of individualistic decision-making is skewed, then those kinds of sexual acts, at their base, are pleasurable and wanted sorts of things. If any of that remains unclear or controversial to the gentler readers, consider the orgasm. With very, very few exceptions, the having of an orgasm is in point of fact a pleasurable sort of thing. One may not feel like it ATM, indeed, rape victims that orgasm during the rape report that the experience itself is bad, it makes them feel violated and betrayed by their own bodies. Nonetheless, it is in point of fact pleasurable. This is what I mean here, that all these kinds of sexual acts are as a matter of point of fact pleasurable, and in that sense they are also therefore wanted sorts of things. Not wanted in the sense of any given moment, perhaps much like also the wanting of an orgasm immediate post-orgasm is not typically a thing, but wanted in the sense that upon iteration of sexual relations these are wanted, desirable sorts of things. We may still find that there are significant sexual orientations, gay, bi, lesbian and hetero, whereby individuals have in some sense a kind of unwantedness to sexual acts with certain kinds of bodies. However, this too is somewhat highly dubious, and very often, maybe most often falters rather strongly on the issues laid out in this piece. Specifically issues like its tabooed nature, dispositions of people being formulated upon bad faith cultures that form their understandings, and rather plainly people who have never tried it assuming that they will definitely not like it. Still, it wouldn't surprise me a great deal if there is in fact some sense of sexual orientation that is meaningfully applicable to people regardless of if we strip away all issues of culture, preferencing, and hyper-individualistic thinking. There may, in other words, be some sorts of biological, physiological underpinning to people's sexuality. Of course, the upshot of that is that no individual can really know that without having actually tried. It is simply unclear to what degree the cultural conditioning, tabooed structures, and individual preferencing is actually making people think that they are this or that sexuality. The alternative is that sexuality as such is a matter of pleasure. Which isn't to suggest that sexual relationships are reducible to that. Relationships have a lot more to them than merely sexuality, even sexual relationships. But insofar as we are speaking of sexuality, the very plausible view is that the cultures shape the sexuality a great deal, and much of it is lies. Hence, the sex-positive view, an ethical imperative being laid out here. The notions of good, giving, game and relationship fidelity as an ethical imperative likewise has an ethical value associated with its tendency to break the unethical aspects of tabooed acculturation and individualistic preferencing. Among those unethical practices being those laid out in this series as a whole, the systemic sexual violence committed through one-way executive authority, and its byproduct of individual instances of sexual violence. Game, or more aptly, being game, entails an avoidance of the dispositions that one is simply given regarding sexuality. The spirit of exploration, of trying, of making an effort, very specifically in regards to meeting the needs, wants and desires of one's lovers. In the current, wherein there remain many who hold bigoted views and tabooed aspects of sexuality, being game takes on the form of reshaping those kinds of views towards a sex-positive perspective. In the longer term, however, being game takes on a fairly different aspect. After all, once it is the case that the tabooed and bigoted views are no more, there isn't any particular value in reshaping them. As with other aspects of sexuality, it is unclear to what extent these kinds of bigoted and tabooing practices are indelible to the species. I suspect fairly strongly that it is not heavily indelibly a part of the species, given the evidence when looking across cultures and throughout history. In other words, assuming that there are no inherent cultural practices, which would be pretty odd if there were, then it follows that the historical fact that differing cultures have at various times and places held views of sexuality that are not bigoted, or whereby sexuality is not tabooed, entails that such is a largely plausible thing to aim for culturally speaking. In terms of being game for sexuality in general, within the contexts whereby the tabooed and bigoted are largely removed, the notion takes on a fairly beautiful, ethical formulation of joyful expressions of one's sex and love. Being game for sexuality, for the exploration of sexuality, is in some sense the least controversial, though it is typically understood as containing hard boundaries predicated especially upon sexual orientation. Suggesting to a gay person that they try out sexuality with someone of a different sex, or a straight person try out sexuality with someone of the same sex may come across as somewhat off-putting, to put it mildly. I can only strongly suggest that the same sorts of elements that taboo this or that sexual expression may very well be in play, and hence that the suggestion of such ought not be dismissed outright. Being game entails being game for those sorts of sexual expressions. Likewise, there are aspects of sexuality that folks may very well find distasteful for reasons that are, shall we say, not exactly unreasonable. Water sports, scat play, blood play, and really a host of kinks that get into behaviors whereby it is not that difficult to grasp at why someone might not be game to simply try it out is a thing. That said, it is also the case that when it comes to the processes of wooing someone, the delicacies and intricacies of serenading them, of delving into their desires is fairly important. These sorts of kinks may be somewhat better phrased as wooing processes, setting the mood, where wooing takes on a more iterative form, rather than the initial wooing of and by someone's to get them on the bed at all. The point therein being something understood in the current as issues associated with kink shaming. But I want to delve into that a bit deeper than is usually done. Specifically, I want to approach it from the point of view of respecting other cultural expressions of sexuality and love's many musings, in the context of being game for something, rather than the atomized context of this or that kink. The supposition is that the various kinks constitute base predicable modalities of cultural expression, the kinds of building blocks that cultures are predicated upon. To place this within the relevant context of the philosophical discourses, such is the kind of expressions we might expect from a deconstructionist effort. What falls out of the process of deconstructing the existing socio-cultural norms, from the tabooing various sexual acts, is exactly the very human disposition to woo one another with some song or dance, both intuitively onto the bed, and the iteratively around the house in a variety of fashions and fashionable kind kinks. To put on a costume, to present oneself as being game for sexuality of this or that sort. But also to say the right things, to present the right form, to make the correct offer, whereby each of these is highly fungible. Being game understood in that context is akin to being accepting of another's culture, and also the willingness to be open with one's own cultural expressions. Not merely welcoming or understanding, but accepting in the sense that the cultural sexual expression is practiced. However, building blocks as such do not a cultural expression make. And there are some building blocks that are unethical in the immediate practice, and still others that become unethical upon iterative processing of them. Uncontroversially, pedophilia, understood as sexual expressions between someone who is post-puberty with someone who is prepubescent, is an unethical sort of behavior as an immediate practice, and an iterative one for that matter. More controversially, though this is far more a modern concern than a historical one, sexuality with post-pubescence with others beyond a certain age is generally understood as an ethical bad. There are actual howevers associated with that. For instance, what age exactly sexuality between teenagers is not generally thought to be an ethical bad so much as a pragmatic bad, as in teenage pregnancies are a pragmatic problem, and so forth. Likely controversially, though I'll flatly point out that this aspect proves the point, in societies whereby effective modern birth control isn't yet a reality, the marrying off of teenagers at a young age, to our modern eyes, is not an ethical bad. It is ethically sound within the constraints of the society's means of birth control. That is, it is exactly an expression of birth control sans the effective modern birth control. Incest is another instance of unethical sexual behavior, even if it is consensual. Beyond the age and incest issue, however, it isn't entirely clear as to what sorts of sexual acts are likely actually unethical in the immediate application. Though I suppose it's, somewhat sadly, worth mentioning that sexuality with non-human animals is another example of something that almost certainly is an unethical sort of sexual behavior for a variety of reasons. I am generally not interested in discussing non-human animals to human sexual behavior though, so I am just going to leave that as a short note. With the notable plausible exception of sexual intercourse with non-human intelligent life forms, as in space aliens, seems perfectly plausibly fine. Though, not necessarily entirely relevant ATM. It is tempting to hold that there simply are no consensual sexual behaviors between consenting adults that are unethical in the immediate practice. But, that is actually somewhat unclear, and I don't think that there is a philosophical methodology of generalizing those behaviors. For instance, it is plausible that race play is an example of consensual sexual behavior between adults that is unethical. Understanding race play as being the manifestation of racism within the context of sexuality, playing out racist roles within the context of sexuality. It is plausible too, however, that this isn't unethical sorts of behavior. It may after all be the case that by doing so folks aren't constituting racism so much as taking it out in the bedroom, pragmatics of sexual therapy. It's too much of a leap to suppose that folks doing race play in the context of sexuality are actually thereby prone to do those sorts of things in other contexts. After all, it isn't the case, as far as I can tell at any rate, that doing any other sort of sexual act necessitates any particular behavior outside the context of the bedroom. But it may, and that is where the crux of the issue may lay. On the other hand, it may very well be the case that acting it out in the bedroom is a kind of medicine for those sorts of, shall we say, cultural and spiritual ills. For instance, rape play, that is, consensual non-consent, may very well be a methodology whereby victims of rape, and indeed, potential rapists, may take it out in ethical ways, and work through their trauma experiences. In any case, The question as to if people take what happens in the context of the bedroom into the context outside the bedroom is itself a plausibly dubious sort of thing. There are plausibly other sorts of issues that may carry forth into longer terms kinds of harms through iterative formal structures. For instance, consensual sexual slavery may entail certain longer-term kinds of harms that only really arise in the iterative formal structure. As in, the sexual slave and indeed the sexual master may each through iterative practice thereof become worse off for the experience. Each taking on those traits into contexts that are not restricted to the merely sexual. Holding for instance that the proper role of someone outside the sexual is as a slave or a master, or simply just behaving as such. Similar might be said for a fair number of otherwise kind kinks, whereby the dispositions within the sexual take on as dispositions outside the sexual, or whereby the sexual dispositions become the norm of living for the people involved. Reduction of people to the merely sexual, in other words. Where one's whole life becomes one sexuality, we might find such as being indicative of a problem of some ethical import. Recall here we are attempting to examine the notion of being gay, what the ethics of that actually may be. If it is the case that there are some unethical sorts of sexual behavior, after all, then being gay for that is not ethical. There is another kind of concern that touches upon the same issue as taking sexual behavior out of the context of the bedroom, plausibility of iterative unethicalness. Perhaps the most immediate plausible instances of which being the roles of sub and dom. These very common roles within the context of the bedroom have no obvious harms associated with them in the context of the bedroom. Several other pieces in the Rape of the Swan series denote unobvious harms that occur in the iterative form of the dom/sub relationship, the supposed one-way executive authority of the sub in particular. In a meaningful sense, a fair amount of the academic feminist lit attempts to highlight the plausible unethical harms associated with the dom's imposition of their will without consent in the bedroom, but also the harms associated with the dom's role taken outside the bedroom, I'll here denote as the patriarchal concerns. This series has also attempted to illustrate some of the harms associated with the sub-role taken outside the bedroom, the disposition to claim weakness, oppression, inability, etc., in order to get someone else to do something that the sub actually wants. The disposition to selectively select towards the ends and aims of obtaining the kind of lover they want, thereby creating the groundwork for such things as racism, bigotry, and sexism. The matriarchal kinds of concerns. And of course, as this series is holding, that these kinds of dispositions are actually constitutive of a heteronormative structure, rather than either specific gendered structure. That these kinds of things happen make it somewhat plausible that folks participating in sexual behavior that is ethical within the bedroom, such as race play or rape play, may thereby lead to behavior outside the bedroom that is unethical. Again, however, note that the relation is not obvious, and it is not obviously unethical either. It may be the case, after all, that the sort of behavior that accrues upon iteration of the behavior is not really a bad. That said, in the current one plausible bad associated with iteration of various sexual behaviors is the disposition to come to identify the self with those sorts of behaviors. To essentialize oneself, and hence to others, as if they were in fact identifiable as little more than those roles. To keep it tame, it is one thing to be gay, hetero, trans, lesbian, bisexual. It is another thing entirely to hold that those sexual behaviors are actually the totality of one's identity. Likewise, it is one thing to enjoy a given kink, it is another thing entirely to make that kink the entire formulation of one's identity. In the context of being gay, we can perhaps understand that that distinction is plausibly the differentiation between the ethical immediate and the unethical iterative form. Being game for a given sexual act, that is plausibly ethical. The unethical aspects only come to the fore if the individuals involved take them as being indicative of their identity as such. Building blocks of a culture perhaps they are, but they are not thereby constitutive of the entirety of cultural or personal identity. What emerges from the building blocks is not the same as, nor entirely reducible to, the building blocks from which they emerge. Meaningfully, such amounts to exactly how seriously people really take sexuality. When taken overly seriously, sexuality, and hence two loving relations, take on the form of a battlefield, of war, of the utmost importance. This is critically important to note in the current, that it doesn't really matter what direction that kind of seriousness is going. Queer bashing has been a blood sport for a long time, and by doing so society creates the conditions whereby sexuality and love's relations become a battlefield. It is fair enough for the queers to hold that they were just defending themselves. That in reaction to the queer bashing, the holding on to the queer identities as identities became a matter of survival. Still, the case remains that the demarcation of identity and culture along the grounds of sexual identity is a dubious prospect. Recognizing the dynamic involved that creates those sorts of conditions upon iteration is important. In terms of the heteros and the monogamous folks, they've tended to take their sexualities as indicative of their identities, and predicate their cultural expressions as exactly that. Which, again, creates the conditions whereby sexualities and love's relations becomes a battlefield, a war zone. In either and indeed, in any case, these kinds of dispositions run strongly counter to the notion of being game, of exploration, enjoyment, kindness, givingness, and indeed, goodness. See also the discussion on the pragmatics of cultural expression between differing cultures in the Odd Questions of Privilege, a slight history of colonialism. Here simply note that the teaching of the young guns a given cultural expression with the understanding that they will need to also be taught to interact with different cultures in a non-genocidal manner, especially as they grow up, is the main thrust. That they may change via such interactions isn't indicative of a cultural loss, so much as indicative of exactly how cultures change. Being game, being down to do sexuality in a variety of ways, of exploring sexuality and love's relations, goes a fair ways towards combating the tendency of overly strong identification with one's sexual orientation as an identity. Noting again that it doesn't matter if the tendency is towards some particular sexual orientation, towards particular sexual acts. The issue in any of these cases leans heavily towards the formation on a personal level of overly strong identification with a particular modality of sexuality. Monolithic formulation of personal identity predicated upon overly simplistic understandings of basic sexuality, and essentialization of personhood to the mereness of sexuality. What is required in a kind of ethical sense is a disposition of levity towards sexuality. A joyfulness, kindness, givingness, and goodness towards one's lovers. Folks ought to get a sense of the issues associated with restrictive views on sexualities as an issue within the realities of people's lives. How that sort of sex-negative view creates echoes, ripples, along scalarly relevant forms. The iterative effects of which are tantamount to the issues within intimate loving sexual relationships, and within the cultural expressions that are fairly well infantile in their formulations, and thoroughly warlike in their dispositions towards each other. Such ought be a lesson as to the stupidity involved with formulating whole cultural bodies, personal identities, and relationship structures predicated upon such things alone. Being game is being levitied in one's disposition, and not taking overly serious one's own dispositions. Relationship fidelity. Firstly, this has to be distinguished from sexual fidelity, and indeed, love's fidelity. In either of these kinds of fidelities, the notion is exclusivity in form. In the former, sexual fidelity, in its classical formulation, such is a fundamental failure by categorical error. It mistakes love for sexuality. It holds rather dimly that sexual expressions are necessarily expressions of loves, at least in among its worst conceptualizations. Less terrible formulations of sexual fidelity may take the formal notion of sexuality as being something sacred, which I don't want to suggest that it isn't, but then it takes that sacredness as indicative of its exclusivity in form. Somewhat ironically so in at least the major monotheistic traditions, given that the non-exclusivity of the divine love is supposed to be the template. In its most reasonable formulations, such denotes a lot of pragmatics of concern related to parentage, familial stability, and protections against the spread of sexually transmitted infections. Its most reasonable formulation, however, is far less applicable in the current, effective modern contraceptives, medicines, and safer sex practices entail that these kinds of concerns are not necessarily best addressed via the ethical norm of sexual fidelity. Love's fidelity is relevant, but generally misconstrued, and functionally speaking the misconstrual follows from the notion of sexual fidelity. Specifically, the misconstrual occurs through the ethical soundness of sexual fidelity as a normative behavior in its most reasonable formulation. It makes sense, in other words, in a world whereby sexual fidelity is ethically sound, to hold to some version of love's fidelity, especially as it relates to other sexual sorts of relationships. In regards to the relevant religious traditions, we may very well hold that such amounts to a broadening of the capacity of love's fidelities. In other words, the miraculous of the modern medicines, birth controls, and safer sex practices, all brought forth via the light of reason, entail and grant a greater capacity of love's fidelities than was present before. Love's fidelities remain relevant when it is not so misconstrued. That is, maintaining long-term loving relationships remains relevant for a wide variety of reasons. Not least of which, pragmatically speaking, is that such is by far in the best interests of any children of a given sexual relationship. More than this, however, love's fidelities is important as a matter of ethical praiseworthiness for the lives of peoples involved. The doing of love's works towards each other, in other words, is ethically praiseworthy for those involved, as both in the doing and the receiving of love's works are the quality of the lives of the people involved improve. Still, love's fidelities are not the same thing as relationship fidelities, and it is relationship fidelities that I want to address here. What is meant by relationship fidelities fundamentally amounts to degrees of commitment towards those with whom one has a relationship with. This regardless of, for instance, the sexual or love's relations involved. It is somewhat convenient to think of such in terms of familial relationships, but such ought not be thereby exclusively understood as such. Friendship relationships, and broader community relationships, are all fruitfully understandable from the perspective of relationship fidelities. Here, however, we are primarily focusing on sexual relationships, and what relationship fidelities entails. To be fairly blunt about it, relationship fidelities persist in the face of sexualities and love's relations that are not so exclusively held. To be sexual with someone else, or to love someone else, or to be sexually loving someone else, does not entail a breach of relationship fidelities. Moreover, it isn't merely that it doesn't entail it, it is that it ought not be construed as entailing it. There is, in other words, an ethical imperative involved to maintain relationship fidelity. Such is tempered a fair amount by issues surrounding abusive relationships, and ought not be construed as maintaining that any particular kind of relationship ought be maintained. Relationship fidelity is understandable as trust that the other persons in the relationship are effectively committed to maintaining that relationship in the face of especially other sexual relationships, loving relationships, or sexually loving relationships. In a very meaningful sense, folks ought understand this as going so far as to be a testament to the strength or weakness of a given relationship. That is, if a relationship is so meager, or perhaps more to the point, if an individual is so meager as to hold that a relationship ought to falter in the face of sexuality or love's relations with someone else, then there is something wrong with how that person is understanding loves and sexuality. The most common culprit for such a faltering is the individualistic viewpoint, the selfish self-centered viewpoint, that holds some version of the following. The relationship merely wasn't making me happy. Again, not to suggest that the same applies to abusive relationships. There are points whereby abusive relationships ought be ended. The ethical imperative, however, is to work within the constraints of a relationship in order to exactly fulfill each other's needs, wants, and desires. Ultimately, this is what is primarily the ethical ordering principle for any meaningful sexual relationship, more so as it regards sexual loving relationships. What relationship fidelity entails, in other words, is a kind of commitment towards exactly that end, while maintaining the capacity to love and be sexual with others. It is very much worth pointing out that this is a serious kind of error in monogamous relationships. Though again, I would point out the most reasonable version of sexual and love's fidelity as being relevant prior to the advent of effective modern contraceptives, medicines, and safer sex practices. I'd go one further on the point, and hold that sexual and love's fidelities has relevance in the sense of taming otherwise out of control sexual expression. Specifically, absent any ethical standard or norm, the degree whereby the human species may act unethically towards each other may have been rather profound, and indeed may still be. In the current, this presents itself as something of a problem, but my suspicion is that it is far more an echo of a problem than an actually existing problem. That is, there are many people who have been trained to think and act along the lines of monogamous modalities of thought for a very long time. They may very well be performing that sort of modality in thinking and ethicity of action predicated upon a reality that just isn't present anymore. Or, at any rate, isn't as present anymore. The issues of especially paternity, for instance, are of the utmost importance for everyone involved. That is, establishing paternity. I don't mean to imply anything by that, in any sense save this: paternity is not something that is easily established when the maternal has many different male lovers, and maternity is generally rather straightforwardly determined. Rare are the instances whereby maternity is an unknown. It is important for the maternal, the paternal, and the children. In the current, this kind of concern remains, but is seriously mitigated through the use of contraceptives, some more than others. The ethical aim ought be understood not as sexual fidelity or love's fidelity. Loves and sexuality are both goods, albeit neither being unqualifiably so. Having the capacity, in other words, to love others, and be sexual with others, each constitutes a good. The ethical aim is that of the quality of the good associated with the loves and sexual relationships. Monogamous relationships carry with them a kind of burden that stems from their reliance on sexual and love's fidelity. For the religiously inclined, we ought to understand such as a burden that amounts to a trade-off on the ethical underpinnings of human nature. That is, something that contextually made sense in terms of the times whereby it was instituted. Modern effective contraception, medicines, and safer sex practices removes those burdens placed upon sexuality and loves. Here it is fruitful to draw upon much of the academic feminist lit regarding the emotive elements involved in their critiques of patriarchy, more pointedly and more aptly put, though they far too oft fail to denote it as such, their critiques of the heteronormative complex. Noting of course, as this series has been, that in the current the lit is so heavily produced by women that its biases are showing. I don't particularly want to cite it, and I doubt it is much required, as its notions are in the culture at this point. Here, let's just say that jealousy, overprotectiveness, feelings of insecurity, failures to trust, along with issues associated with sexual violence can be understood as stemming from exactly the strictly monogamous modality. It creates a sense of ownership, rather than responsibility, loves, and a sexual givingness towards one's lovers. When everyone else is understood as a rival for one's love's affections, attention, time, and sexuality, the not surprising outcome are things like jealousy, a sense of ownership, difficulties in trust, overprotectiveness, and so forth. Hence too the importance of relationship fidelity. When lovers have a sense that their relationship is constantly hanging in the balance, they will tend to also bring forth issues of trust, possessiveness, jealousy, etc. This occurs within the framework of relationship anarchy as much as it occurs within strictly monogamous relationships. Relationship anarchy entails exactly such a lacking in any sense of relationship fidelity that there is essentially no trust. The disposition therein is that no one needs anyone else, that each person ought be sufficient on their own. The fear such a view entails is rather intense. In order to satiate that fear, the whole of the society has to cater to them, their particular needs, wants, and desires. They require the capacity to live alone and to be safe and secure as they do so. Self-sufficiency is their calling card. They tout individualism as a norm of behavior. Of course, such entails in essence no meaningful relationship. At most such folks tend towards a view of others as helpful roommates. In their sexuality they express the demand that their own needs, wants and desires be met, but they give no consideration as to the needs, wants and desires of their lovers. Their lovers are instrumentally important to them, they may do better with sex dolls than with lovers. In their loving relationships, their concerns are similar. How, they wonder, is this person useful to me? Relationship fidelity to them is practically a dirty word. It burdens them with responsibilities as soon as the relationship is no longer instrumentally useful to meeting their needs, wants, and desires. The level of fear there borders or surpasses that of paranoia. It is systematic of an individualistic society. Among its many failings are its inability to grasp at the kinds of sexual and loving expressions that can come from being giving to one's lovers. They assume, after all, that all their lovers have the same aim as them. Such amounts to a deprivation of love's expressions, and so too, with sexuality's expressions. So, what does relationship fidelity amount to? Commitment towards each other. Perhaps in some fundamental sexual level, commitment towards meeting one's lover's needs, wants and desires. But a bit more than that too. Does it necessarily entail a hierarchical structure? That is, a placement of an individual or several individuals as being more important than some others. Sure, though it is strictly unclear if that is what folks have tended to mean when they speak of concerns about hierarchical structures. There are pragmatics involved in relationships, after all. Or at least, unless we begin speaking of certain spiritual aspects of relationships. There are temporal limits, in other words, regarding how individuals spend their time, efforts, and energies. Relationship fidelity in part speaks towards those commitments of time spent together and efforts made towards doing things together. It is important to note that relationship fidelity doesn't necessarily entail a coupling. This is rather obviously true in terms of immediate familial relations. That is, in a non-sexual manner, an individual is going to tend towards favoring their immediate familial relations, their close friends, and so forth. Likewise, such is true when it comes to multiple lovers. It is perfectly plausible to maintain multiple relationships that are more or less on a par with each other. Such can mean living together, or just having other lovers as close friends. Such is particularly well suited when a set of lovers is sexually intimate with another set of lovers together. Relationship fidelity entails being committed to a relationship, though perhaps not necessarily, towards some specific mutual aim. In conjunction with the GGG, relationship fidelity entails commitment to mutual adaptation towards one's lovers over a longer haul. To perhaps put it in the more relevant terms, relationship fidelity entails sticking around through the harder ships, the rougher patches, not cutting and running when things get tough. A kind of commitment to maintain a relationship despite significant adaptations over time. A commitment towards the adaptations being towards and with one's lovers, rather than away from. Folks ought understand this section as a proposal regarding how communication between lovers ought to occur. A reply and answer to the quandary left hanging, rotting on the table, with the insipid claim that folks ought just talk it out. The suggestion here is that this framework provides folks with the proper mutually beneficial understandings whereby those kinds of conversations can happen in a productive way that isn't bullshitty or devolving to a mere battle of the wheels.
뭐래 이거?